This is welcome to the introduction of beekeeping. I hope that everybody can hear me. If you can't, I would appreciate on the, I can see now that I'm on. I'm trying to increase the size of the screen that is on your computer, and maybe at this end that I can do that. I'm not entirely sure. So I'm trying to fidget with this. There is a 15-second delay, and that is the problem. So, welcome to the introduction of beekeeping. This course is intended to give you a better insight as to how to manage honeybee colonies. Too many people are attracted to beekeeping and have no training or no knowledge about what they are learning and what they're doing. And as a result, the consequences are that a lot of their beehives die in their first or second year. So with this, I'm trying to give you a whole set of information about how to, also the reasons why you should manage them or do certain things and not other things. So to start out with, of course, as you know, honeybees are the only honeybees that were introduced into the Americas. They were not native to the Americas. They came from Europe 400 years ago, and they have become by far the most important pollinator of agriculture today. I'm seeing here showing a paused main screen. My apologies, I continue to have struggles with this. I apologize for this. I have to try to figure out how to get the full screen. There it is. I don't know why it is popping back and forth. All right. When you got your notice earlier with a reminder about you signing in, I suddenly realized that at the bottom it said if you do not, or if you cannot participate in this webinar, please cancel your registration. Please don't do that. When you register on your computer and you register in your name, you actually register for all 4 classes over the next 4 weeks. And so you don't have to re-register every time. So please keep that in mind. Just ignore that. If you cannot attend any of these classes or these live webinars, you have, of course, the option that later you will be able to view this particular presentation. After this screen or after this webinar is done, everything is being recorded as what I have mentioned before in emails, and after a couple of hours, the service provider will send me a code, an access code. And this access code I will distribute by email to everyone, and that will give you the means of viewing the presentation from the beginning to the end. Okay. And so for every class, you will get a access code sent to you after the webinars have been done. And at the end of the course, you will probably have 4 of these access codes. Okay? And you can run them then for as many times as you want until for about 2 months, because by that time the contract with the service provider will be finished. Okay, so I started out with talking about these honeybees being the first ones that were introduced into North America 400 years ago, and they have been a critical component of modern agriculture since that time. But honeybees are, of course, not the only ones that play a role in the environment and in the ecosystems. There are an estimated 3,500 different types of different species of bees, not honeybees, but bees, here in North America. Many of them are, or the vast majority, are solitary bees. In other words, they live on their own and complete their life cycle by themselves. Um, and many of them cannot be managed or cultivated because they require unique climatic conditions or vegetation or soil conditions in which they can build their nests. And often that is simply not a practical thing to do in an agricultural setting. Honeybees, of course, have the great advantage that you can have a huge number of them in a box, and you can transport them. You can move them from one place to another to not only ensure pollination of a crop, but also to move them to a location where they can produce a honey crop, and that is ultimately what a lot of beekeepers are after. So I sent you yesterday a set of an email with a set of suggested reading materials, and again, it is not mandatory. It is strictly to complement the information that I present in this webinar. One of the things is that you have, of course, a set of books that is on fact sheet number 003. That is only a suggested reference materials. There will be some other books mentioned in this course later, dealing with diseases, and also one dealing with osmia bees or blue orchard mason bees, or and those fall outside of the strictly textbooks of honeybees. But I will refer to them at a later time. There is also a list of equipment suppliers. We recently updated that. That is 006, and that is strictly a suggested list. That is not in any way that we are promoting one supplier over another. Please don't run out and start buying equipment, because in the next webinar, next week, I will be talking in greater detail, or quite a bit of detail, about the equipment that you will use to run honeybee colonies. And you may want to wait with buying equipment until we have that class completed, because you may want to change your thinking about which equipment you want to purchase. There is also going to be quite a bit of detail about the actual dimensions and about how to, why one design is better than another design, and I will go through all of this in greater detail. There is also fact sheet number 102, and 102 deals with beekeeping terms. And beekeepers have a tendency to start using all kinds of terms that in the beginning are sounding perhaps unfamiliar or bewildering to you, but you will get used to that fairly quickly. One of the typical things that a lot of beekeepers do is they use the term colony and hives simultaneously. It's almost like, oh, well, how many colonies do you have? Or, hey, how many hives do you operate? Hives, technically a hive is a hive body in which we house the bees, and inside of this house you have a colony. Okay, but that is kind of intermixed. People use the same phrase for the same thing, but you will get used to that very quickly. There are also two other fact sheets, 104 and 111, and this one deals with the honeybee colony, the way how it functions, what it is comprised of, and of course also bee behavior. All these things are important as a beekeeper to understand, simply because it will give us a venue and a better understanding as to why bees do things they do and why they don't do certain things. It is important to remember that, of course, a honeybee colony, as well as all pollinators, can only function well in an environment that supports them. And honeybees, as all other pollinators, derive their food sources from floral sources. They're vegetarians. And principally they collect pollen and they collect nectar. The nectar is fuel in the tank. In other words, it is the carbohydrate source they need to work and to fly, to walk around, to have the energy to do things. The pollen is collected by bees for growth, for tissue development, and for raising their babies, the bee brood. And this is when we have sometimes certain temporary shortages of food, pollen or nectar, in the late spring, we call that a dearth period, you will see that the decline of the population happens fairly quickly afterwards. When the bees are under stress in such a situation, there is often also the result that they end up developing certain diseases as a result of the shortage of food. When the availability of food comes back very quickly, the bees will pick it up again, and often the disease disappears again. In class number 3, 2 weeks from now, this will be totally dedicated to bee diseases and pests. And unfortunately, we have to spend quite a bit of time on bee health issues, on bee diseases, because it is in the last 30 years or so, there has been quite an introduction and an infusion of different diseases that have come into our beehives, and the result of it is that if you don't manage to either recognize it or control it effectively, the bees will suffer, and in many cases the bees will die. So we will spend quite a bit of time on that, and bee disease management has become a key component of the overall management that we have in beekeeping today. And today I first would like to spend quite a bit of time on the pollination aspect of it, and the crop pollination issues, and that is actually the background, if you will, that all pollinators face in order to do well or to do poorly. That is the environment in which they operate. And the reason that I emphasize this so much is that over the decades, I have learned that there is a lot of beekeepers who fail to place enough recognition into what the environment offers their bees. Too many beekeepers are focused on one thing, and that is honey production. They think that by putting a box in the backyard and you put some bees in it, you're a beekeeper. Well, that's not the way it operates. The bees are totally dependent on the environment, and it is the importance of planting appropriate bee forage plants throughout the season, things like this, that really supports them. And I can drive through many urban areas today, or for that matter even in rural areas, and although that may be looking very green, they are actual virtual deserts for bees, simply because there is no floral source available that provide them a food source. Okay. There are often too many wrong plants planted. And it is for that reason that in recent years there is much greater emphasis placed on improving local habitats again. I also like to emphasize, or to put it into context, in the last 50 years or so, here in North America, we have seen a massive transition in the landscape in which pollinators have functioned. Many wild, undisturbed habitat has been converted into agricultural lands and crop production systems, and many of those crops are first of all not providing bee forage. And if they do, then it is often when they are in flower that is mostly for a very short period of time, and after that there is in that environment no other bee forage available at all. It's interesting, here in the Fraser Valley we of course have the most important crash crop is blueberry, and honeybees are widely used for that purpose to ensure that that crop is set or pollinated. And the interesting thing is there that we often see, of course, with these monocultural practices, that after the flowering has taken place, that the bees that are there, if you would keep them there, they will face hunger, if not starvation, because there's nothing else to fly on. Honeybees are generally better off in that sense than natural pollinators or native pollinators, because not only are there beekeepers who look after them and can move them to another location, but honeybees are also long distance flyers. And the reason that they're long versus native pollinators, which are by definition short distance flyers. The reason for this is that honeybees can communicate with each other. They talk to each other, not verbally, but through a variety of pheromones or hormones that they release and share with each other inside of the hive, as well as they have the so-called wiggle dance, which is a system in which they can tell each other where they can find a food source. So when bees in the morning can get out of the hive and go to the first ones that do so are scouts, and they will find a food source maybe a mile away. They will come back and they will measure the distance as well as the position in relation to the hive and to the sun. You can read up on that in other literature, but eventually they will come back to the hive and tell all their sisters and their fellow foragers where that food source is. So instead of wasting energy and time to go to that food source, the bees will be able to go out and know exactly where to find it without wasting energy. And therefore they are able to fly great distances. Bumblebees, which are also social insects, they also create colonies in which they have one nest shared by a whole bunch of individuals. They don't do this communication. So every time bumblebees go out of the nest, they have to reorient themselves and think, oh, I was here before, I may have found some food source here or there, and they are kind of independent operators who share a nest. Okay. So the importance is, and that is the reason why if you look at the late season in the summertime, when you look at a honeybee colony, that can be comprised of some 30,000 or 40,000 individual bees all in that nest. And the only reason that it is possible for them to become that large is because they have an operating range and foraging range that is so huge they can take food sources from a much larger area than bumblebees can. And then beyond the bumblebees, of course, you have a whole number of different species of other pollinators. And those ones are all solitary bees, and there are only a very few that are actually cultivated or managed by man. The most common one here is here in British Columbia would be the blue orchard mason bee, or the bob, or osmia bee. And there is a particular reference to that fact sheet number 506 refers to the osmia bee. That is a solitary bee. And please keep in mind that the world of bees is a female-dominated world. The males that mostly occur only for very short periods of time. And of course, it's quite obvious what their function is. Their function is strictly to pass on the genetic material from one generation to the other through mating. They are not participant in providing food and looking after the nest or looking after the bee brood or anything like this. They just mate, and after mating they tend to die. That are the mated females that are responsible for raising the young ones. And in solitary bees, many of those will find a small little crevice or a hollow stem of some vegetation in which they can provision the nest. Blue orchard mason bees have become very popular in recent years because some wilted beekeepers have become tired of fighting various diseases and having to use drugs or chemicals or whatever in order to control these diseases, and therefore they have chosen to do something simpler and get into blue orchard mason bees. I have a few of those nests, but I don't dare to bring them here into my office because the temperature here is higher, and I do not wish to disturb them and have any of them emerge while I'm talking. However, uh, perhaps during this course I will show you the nest designs that they have, and I will also share with you a booklet for those that are interested in blue orchid mason bees. That is a booklet. It is an excellent publication. It's how to manage the blue orchid bee or bob. It's a book that is also freely available through through an email that a PDF file that I can share with you. So I will share this with you in a next tomorrow or in the next few days, and you can have a look at it. It's an excellent guide in how to operate blue orchid mason bees. As I mentioned, that is a solitary bee, which is the female just lays her eggs in a tube nest, a tunnel, if you will, in which it will first lay eggs that are small chambers. In each chamber there is an egg that will develop into a female, and it is only the last few chambers she creates where males will be raised. And in early spring they will come out, and the males will hang around near the nest and wait for the females to emerge. They will then mate, and those females will then start their nest. Okay. Let me try this again with this darn screen. I'm bothered by it being, oops, why it doesn't. I do not know why it isn't doing the main screen. I apologize for that. Okay, the other main, there it is. I better not touch it at all anymore. The other main solitary bee that is cultivated is the alfalfa leafcutter bee, or ALCB. This is a megachile. It's a small bee that evolved in the Mediterranean basin and is particularly suitable, as what the name suggests, to pollinate alfalfa. This is a very small and a pretty bee, and that has basically a very similar brood cycle the way we have it with the blue orchid mason bee. This bee is not very suitable here for coastal British Columbia because it requires high temperatures and dry conditions, something typically that you find in the prairie provinces during the summertime. Out here it will be just too cold. They're quite temperature sensitive, and as soon as the temperature goes below 20 degrees, they will stop foraging. So many of these pollinators are specialists. Honeybees, on the other hand, are generalists. And as generalists, they are not necessarily the most efficient pollinator in some crops. I mentioned earlier about blueberries. The other important crop later in the season is cranberries. Both of those plants evolved over millions of years in the temperate zones around circumpolar, in temperate zones, where they co-evolved with bumblebees. And bumblebees are remarkably effective and efficient in pollinating these particular crops or these particular flowers. So bumblebees go out to a blueberry flower, and if you know the blueberry flower, it has a very long, narrow corolla. That's a very tubular kind of flower design, and it has to stick its head in with its long tongue, its proboscis, to be able to access the nectar. And by doing so, it will rummage around in the flower, not inside, but it will just stick its head inside of this tubular affair, and it will collect the pollen grains. But many of these plants in those bog environments often have very wet pollen. So bumblebees is sticky pollen. So bumblebees evolved into acquiring a behavior that honeybees do not display. And it is called the buzzing behavior. When the bumblebee lands onto a flower, it will buzz. And what it does is it will grasp this flower and it will then contract and relax its flight muscles very rapidly without moving its wings. The result of that is that the entire insect vibrates very rapidly, and so does the flower, and it dislodges the wet pollen, and the wet pollen gets stuck onto the hairs. And by doing so, it will go from one flower to another flower, and by doing this, pollination will take place. Okay. The honeybees don't do this. So honeybees are not that effective in doing it, in visiting, let's say, cranberries and blueberries. So in cranberries, the big problem is that the cranberries don't produce any nectar. Okay? So the bees don't derive any benefit from it. All what they do is they get a tiny little bit of pollen. So cranberries are therefore not very attractive to honeybees, and the farmer who rents beehives for making sure that pollination takes place must therefore have much higher densities or higher placement rates of honeybee colonies onto their cranberry fields. And the fee, the pollination fee that goes along with that is therefore also much higher. So right now, a cranberry farmer may have to pay $150 to $170 for 4 weeks or 3 weeks of pollination service in order to have a beekeeper coming out there in the month of June to pollinate cranberry. On the other hand, blueberries has the challenge that it is one of the earliest major crops in flower, and therefore the weather conditions are often still very poor in early spring. The result of it is that the honeybees often don't like to come out of the hive, and they are slow in pollinating. Often, when you get into pollination services, often you get then an angry phone call, or I get often an angry phone call of a farmer who says, you know, I am dealing with this beekeeper and he has lousy bees because the bees don't come out. Keep in mind it takes two to tango. That is to say that if the weather conditions are lousy, the bees may not want to come out, but neither is the flower receptive for fertilization, for going through the process of pollination. So keep that in mind, that you sometimes have a situation where the bees may not be active, but they're not active for very good reason. Okay? As soon as the switch is turned and the weather conditions improve, the bees will be in there in no time. So the question often comes up is to, well, if bumblebees are so much more effective in blueberries compared to honeybees, why don't we use bumblebees instead? The problem is a game of numbers. I mentioned earlier, when you have a honeybee colony, you can bring them in, not just one hive with bees in it, but maybe 100 or whatever you want to do. And at this time of the year, or when the blueberry is in bloom, that is in about April, we will then have an average colony that has been wintered here in British Columbia may have a population of about 15,000 bees. Okay. And with these 15,000 bees, honeybees are kind of fair weather flyers. They don't like to come out when it is lousy, but they like to fly when it is nice and sunny, or not only sunny, but warm enough. So let's be very pessimistic and let's say that only 10% of the bees out of this entire colony would come to pollinate. So that there's 1,500 bees out of a population of 15,000 would be flying at any one time to forage and to visit the blueberry flowers. A bumblebee colony, not managed, just a wild one, at that time of the year may have a total population of 50 individuals, and let's say be we should be optimistic and claim that 50% of that, half the population, would be out foraging under the same weather conditions. And that would mean that you would have 50 individuals flying around pollinating blueberries. The problem is that we have monocultural practices. We have so many acres of nothing but blueberries. And so even though honeybees may be inefficient, if you have 1,500 bees flying around versus 50, that will have inevitably it will compensate for its inefficiency. And keep in mind, a full planting of mature stand of blueberries today here in the Fraser Valley produces roughly 4 to 5 million flowers per acre. And all these flowers have to be revisited, not just once, several times, in order to optimize what we call is fruit set or seed set. And by doing this, the numbers are the key to the enterprise. And that is why we recommend blueberry growers to plant 2 or 3 hives, or place 2 to 3 hives per acre in order to optimize this the fruit set. Ultimately, this will pay off, and I have a presentation that I like to do, a PowerPoint presentation on pollinators and the process of pollination. And I will cut my screen off now, and then I will start with this PowerPoint presentation, and you will be able to hear me while I'm making my commentary. So bear with me for a second, okay? And we'll try to get this going. So here we are. Let me just see what happens now. All right, let me see what happens here. Okay, so here we are in. So this is pollination in agriculture. I put this slide up with with a picture that I got from Europe, where there were in recent times massive protests of farmers who were continuously feeling to be squeezed between an increasing number of society that demands organic food and pesticide-free food and all kinds of other environmental demands that they place on farmers, and yet at the same time society demands the lowest possible price for the food at the highest possible cost. And it is important to focus on this a little bit, simply because this conflict in the demands of what the public at large demands is something that is basically signifies a certain conflict. The role of agriculture, the role of bees in agriculture is a key thing to our well-being today, and I like to emphasize the fact that here in North America and in Europe, in the wealthy parts of the world, we use and spend less of our disposable income on food than anywhere else in the world, and yet the food that we consume is of an extraordinarily high quality. It says that about 1/3 of the food production is dependent on pollinators, and increased it is the case, and honeybees have been particularly becoming more important worldwide, and it is largely because of so many wild pollinator populations have been declining. And just to illustrate this, the estimated annual value of crop production in just in British Columbia is over $400 million per year. Now, it should be noted that there is a large greenhouse industry here as well that is dependent on bumblebees instead of honeybees, because honeybees don't tolerate the confines of a greenhouse. In Canada, there's over $1.8 billion worth of agricultural production that is dependent on honeybee pollination. In the United States, because it is a warmer climate, most of it, they have a total value of over $18 billion, and worldwide, well over $200 billion worth of agricultural production that is dependent on pollinator population, on honeybee population. And this is what it is all about. Complete pollination, as you can see, means that you have fantastic fruit set, and the fruits are large and round and of equal size, and they tend to mature all at the same time. And it is a good example here. If you don't have good pollination in blueberries, they're all shriveled up or aborted fruit. This is an example here of some of the fruits that are dependent on pollinators. They are all very obvious here, apples and pears, peaches, and so on and so on. But coffee as well. Coffee in the tropics is, I do not know what is happening now, but which is interesting. Cucurbits, just pumpkins and everything else. Although cotton, we don't eat cotton, but certainly cotton is dependent on pollinators to produce its crop. Alfalfa and clovers, again, we don't consume those, but these are all supporting the livestock industry. And so here we have just a collection of crops that are insect pollination dependent. Sorry that I have this, I do not know why it is so slow, but this is the four key components or key interests that farmers have, and that is the uniformity of the shape of the fruit and the color, large size, high sugar content, and early maturation. The farmer likes to be the first kid on the block with fresh fruit, and that is what optimizes the income. If you have poor fruit set, the result of it is that much of it ends up in fruit juices or in other forms that are less valuable. To the environment, and that is equally important, is that if you have greater biodiversity, if you have a rich diversity of the pollinator fauna, you end up with a healthier and a more productive habitat as well. And it supports much greater biodiversity. Just to give you a little bit of the background about the biology of and the process of pollination. The entire trick is, of course, is how can you transfer pollen grains that are sitting out here and on these anthers to be moved from there to the female flower part, which is here the stigma. It is this sticky blob that sits on the top, and it is the trick of getting pollen grains from there over to the female part, the stigma. Okay. This is, of course, a flower where you have both males and female parts on the same flower, but there are many plants that have only male flowers and female flowers, or you have even plants that are either male plants or female plants. Take, for example, the kiwi fruit. If you go and want to grow kiwis in your backyard, it is important that you make sure that you have two of them, and one male and one female, in order to ever expect some fruit to come from your female kiwi plant. The process that is involved is transferring the pollen over from the male flower parts to the female flower parts is either done by wind or by a pollinator, by a visitor. And with wind, of course, the problem is that it is often uncontrolled. You don't have any means of knowing where the pollen grains go, and as a result, it tends to go through a lot of waste. Pollinators, on the other hand, are directed in their activity and actually transfer the pollen grain from one flower to another flower. This unique association between the insect pollinators and flowers started about 90 to 95 million years ago. And the insects at that time were the precursors to our pollinators, to our bees. And they were essentially kind of wasp-like ancestors. And they had typically at that time, clearly they were carnivorous. They were just meat eaters and were chasing and eating other insects. Over many millions of years, they start to change both their body size and shape and their mouth parts and other body parts in order to become more dependent on vegetarian diet. The result of that is that they had become fully vegetarian, and that is why bees today are no longer visiting or catching any other insects to feed on. So the cousins of bees are essentially the wasps and the hornets. They have remained carnivorous, or in many of them are omnivorous. They eat both meat and vegetable materials, but the bees are the true vegetarians. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, there are some 4,000 species of 3,500 species in North America of pollinators, and worldwide there are some over 22,000 of them. So this is a good example here where you have Apis mellifera, the honeybee. Mellifera means a honey gatherer, and technically, of course, that is a wrong, I don't know why this is doing what it is doing. It is a wrong name because it should be called Mellifica, which means honey maker, but the original name mellifera stuck, and even though it is technically incorrect, and that is then Apis mellifera is the honeybee, the European honeybee. In British Columbia, it was introduced in the 1880s, and today there are more honeybee colonies in operation than ever before. There are now some 750,000 of them. So often people ask, well, there are these problems with bees. What's going on, and why? How have come that there are now more honeybee colonies in operation than ever before? The difference is, and I will talk about this in class number 3, it has to do with the diseases. Today, there may be many more colonies being operated on or managed. Their service life is shorter, and the input costs to operate them are much higher than what they were maybe 30 or 40 years ago. In the United States, these numbers have been somewhat different. About 50 years ago, there were something like 4 million colonies in operation in the United States, and it has gone down to about 2.5 million. And there are many reasons for that. Of course, the economics play a key role in this. The other thing is also that it has become the nature of beekeeping in commercial beekeeping, that is, in the United States, has changed a lot, and it has become very dependent on crop pollination services as a income stream for many commercial beekeepers. And that requires them to be moving bees from one side of the continent to the other. And you can well imagine that honeybee colonies or the honeybees did not evolve over millions of years to spend most of their lives on the back of a truck. And therefore, that's why there are a lot of problems in the United States because of that migratory beekeeping for keeping these bees in optimum condition. The other thing is that we have become more and more dependent on honeybees in the availability of them because of large acreages of monocultural crops. One and the same crop for miles on end, nothing else. For those of you that live here on the West Coast, if you ever have seen in California the almond groves in bloom in February, it is a magical site in the Central Valley where you have enormous acreage of beautiful flowering, pink flowering almond groves, and there are no native pollinators around to ensure the pollination, and hundreds of thousands of honeybee colonies are brought in from other parts of the United States to realize this particular crop. The almond grows in California. The almond industry of California is responsible for something like 80 to 90% of the world's production of almonds. There are also in many other crops higher density plantings. Many of you are old enough to remember that in the distant past, an apple orchard was comprised of individual trees, nicely spaced out, and you have a wonderful overarching canopy in which all the fruit would be developing. No more. Nowadays, apple varieties are all dwarf varieties. They are grafted on dwarf stock, and they are now grown in rows, similarly to what you can see in a vineyard. And that has significant implications on honeybees that are placed in there, because now honeybees will have to forage along rows rather than in a canopy where they can go from one tree to another. And of course, our demands place high variety yields. Only farmers no longer want to have poor varieties, and so everything has to be optimized. And as I mentioned before, as an example, we now have something like 5 million flowers per acre in a mature stand of high bush blueberries. This has placed enormous demands on the honeybee colonies. An apiary is basically a place where honeybee colonies are kept. That could be as small as one single hive, as you can see here in the front, or it could consist of, here, there are about 20 of them in here, or you could have an apiary of 1,000. Particularly in the wintertime, commercial beekeepers often have a wintering yard or a wintering apiary where they put in hundreds of colonies all in one location. The bees do not come out anyway because there is nothing to forage on, and the bees will stay inside. So it is very handy to have them all in one location, so that when beekeepers come there to clean them up in the early spring, or to feed them, or to provide them some medicine or whatever else they have to do, they don't have to travel to different apiaries. They can all do this in one swoop. Okay. Inside of the hive, well, we have here a good example of what you can see in a hive. As you can see here in the photograph, this hive has one box only. It appears to be one box, and in each box or chamber you will have, as you can see here, you have here 9 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Normally a box like this can accommodate 10 frames. But when they are brand sparking new, people always put in 10 frames because it is nicely sit together. Over time, it becomes harder and harder to remove some of these frames in and out, and that is because there is wax buildup on the shoulders, on the sides of it, here where they touch each other, and the bees sometimes build bridges between them, and it becomes harder and harder to move. So often it is equally or much easier to operate with 9 frames. And people sometimes get worried for, well, then there is too much space in between. No, not really. You can move these frames here a little bit inward, and so they're nice together, because inside this chamber in the central part, you normally have there the nest. That is where the bees raise their brood. And it is a perfect example, and a very beautiful example, of a classic bee brood frame. Here, the central part of it, you see there all these cells that are capped. They have a little cap on top of each, a little cap. And then you will here have a ribbon of nothing. Well, if you look closely inside, there's probably pollen in there. And again, I mentioned earlier, pollen is critically important for raising the babies because that contains protein. And then here on the top of the frame, you will have this capping as well. And this is typically honey that has been capped. As you can see, this capping has a very different appearance from the brood capping. This is sealed. It is a wax layer and it is impermeable to water and to gas or anything else. So it is sealed. The honey underneath it is truly sealed. But this is a capping. The brood capping is actually a porous capping, which allows for the exchange of gas or CO2 and oxygen to go in and out of the cell. Okay. So inside of each of those cells, you will have a baby bee that is developing. So the hive body like this has a stack of them, and in the springtime, and I will display this later with the hive that I have here, the model that I have out here to explain this, but in the springtime you may have a population that is small enough to be housed just in one box or in one chamber or in one super. All these names are intermingled. Beekeepers are often a highly optimistic lot, and they find it necessary to put a whole bunch of boxes on top of each other in the hope that by having a lot of boxes, the bees will just automatically fill it in. Not really. It is important to be careful in the amount of room that you will give your colony. In the springtime, when the weather is still cool or low temperatures, it is not wise to provide them with too much room, because it means that they have far greater difficulty to keep that hive warm. Please remember that this brood that you see out here can only develop successfully when the brood temperature or the nest is maintained at about 30 to 33 degrees Celsius weather. So if you open this up an awful lot or you place too many of these boxes on top of it with frames, the problem is that the bees are shivering and they are having to spend an enormous amount of effort to basically look after the brood and to keep it warm. So instead, it is far more valuable and helpful to the bees by actually housing them in a smaller unit in this early springtime to make sure that they can keep it warm. Only after warmer weather has emerged and you clearly see pollen being brought in and nectar being brought in, that you can then put a second box on, a second super, and allow the bees to expand their nest. You will have to, you can imagine a honeybee colony is essentially going through an expansion and a contraction process through the seasons. So in the winter time, all what is important for the bees is to keep the unit, the colony, alive. And so they're clustered very close together. They don't fly out at all. They could if they want to, but they don't. They are very close together and they are keeping each other warm. And they very slowly circulate within this ball, this cluster. And when the weather starts to improve and they gain access to floral sources and particularly to pollen, you will have the first brood develop, and then they will start to expand, and the colony will then produce more and more bees, and the numbers go up, and at one point you have, over the course of the spring and summer season, a steady expansion of the population. So from a successfully wintered colony of maybe 10,000 to 15,000 bees, it will expand all the way up to about 40 or even more thousand bees in late August. And then when the floral sources start to disappear, you will have then a steady contraction of the population. And then basically from late August all the way to Christmas, you have a healthy colony. It's perfectly fine for it to lose 30, 40, even up to 60% of its entire population because it goes through a natural contraction process. There's no need to feed these huge numbers of bees who most of will die anyway because they come to the end of their lives. So you have a contraction taking place in the fall season and then in the spring and summer a steady expansion. Okay? As I said before, as you can see, the honeybees are walking around out there, and they are up to as many as 40,000 bees. Notice, by the way, this is that beautiful comb, and I will talk about this a bit later. And you see there at the bottom of the cell, it's black. And that is normally not black. It is a plastic foundation that has been used, and they have chosen the color black. I only mention this because it is very visible here, and the reason that some beekeepers prefer that is because it's far easier to see eggs that the queen lays, and for beekeepers to see whether or not there is a proper egg laying going on or not. Okay. So within the colony you have three castes, as most of you probably know already. You have one queen that is responsible for all the egg laying, and then we have a few hundred drones during the course of the summer season. Right now, by the way, in the wintertime, drones are totally useless. They are not doing anything except that they would consume food, and as a result, the colony as a superorganism is not in need of drones at this time. So there are no drones in that colony to speak of. And then we have, and most of the population is comprised of workers. And those workers are all female, and they are daughters of the queen. The queen, as well as the worker bees, are genetically are diploidy. In other words, they all have a double set of chromosomes, as we have as well. So we are comprised of the genetic material of our dad and our mother. The same with the queen and her workers. The queen will have mated early in her life, and she will have collected sperm that she keeps in a small organ called the spermatheca. And that is remarkable in that spermatheca retains this sperm for the rest of her life and is able to keep this sperm viable. It remains viable for all her life. And queen can live all the way up to about 5 years. Okay. But the eggs that she lays normally will turn into a worker bee, and what she will do is that every time she lays an egg, she will also release a sperm cell from that spermatheca, and that fertilized egg will be deposited in the bottom of that cell, and from there you will have a worker bee emerge or develop. Okay. However, this worker bee, and you can see one here on the left side in the photograph, is somewhat smaller than the queen, and she is sterile. She will never be able to, her ovaries will never develop, and will not develop into egg-laying apparatus, and as a result she will also never mate and be able to produce viable offspring. Okay. Sometimes the queen decides to lay some eggs without releasing a sperm cell. So that is just an egg, an unfertilized egg. Well, in many animals, just an unfertilized egg in itself is not viable and it will die. But in the insect world, this is a viable unit, and the egg will then develop into a drone, into a male bee. So the interesting thing is that drones don't have a father because they don't have they just came from the egg. The egg came from that queen. There was no sperm cell involved whatsoever. What this means is that drones express the genes of their mother. That's all what they do. So it is a unique arrangement, if you will, where her genetic composition, her genetic material from that queen is going to be passed on by the drones to the next generation. So the drones, all what the drones want to do is they basically have one mission in life, and that is to try to mate with a virgin queen. And for that they scour the neighborhood all over the place to search for honeybee colonies that may develop, or some queens that will of course have to be mated. And when these queens emerge, she will never mate inside of the nest, but she will then leave the nest with a retinue of worker bees that will guide her along until she comes to what we call a drone congregation area, and kind of an area that is a space somewhere that can be in the environment, that could be marked by a tree or a forest edge or some other feature in the landscape. And within this envelope, in this space, that is the mating area. So as soon as that virgin queen enters it, it is the drones that are flying around in this imaginary envelope of air will then start to chase her and see who can catch her and mate with her. This queen will mate, a dozen times, and will collect all these sperm packets inside of her spermatheca. And after all this mating behavior has come to an end, she will then return to the nest and will, after a few days, she will start to lay eggs. And actually, she will spend the rest of her life inside of this hive, this colony. Sometimes, of course, there is swarming taking place, but I will talk about that a bit later. So the honeybee colony has evolved such that the worker bees, as the name also suggests, are doing all kinds of functions, from cleaning the cells to feeding the babies, the young ones, to guarding the nest on the outside, foraging for water and for pollen and for nectar. So all these maintenance functions are done by worker bees. Drones, as I mentioned earlier, their function is only to pass on the genetic material to the next generation, and they are pretty singular in their outlook or in their purpose. They don't even bother to feed themselves. They don't bother to fly to flowers and collect nectar or pollen. They just basically beg their sisters to feed them. So they don't do anything. Now, some of you may well think well, that is actually not just limited to honeybees. So basically the drones are somewhat single-minded in what they are interested in and what they want to do. They're all highly interdependent on each other. And although I may sound kind of negative towards drones, some beekeepers sometimes put in a lot of effort to kill drones and to remove any of the brood of drones. Don't do that, simply because drone brood is actually an important component of the well-being of the nest. These girls like to have some drones around. It's just, mixed company is far better than just only one gender company. So they are all interdependent of each other. A queen, if she is by herself, and you put her in a cage, for example, she will probably die in a few hours. She cannot be on her own. She has to be nurtured and looked after and groomed and fed and cleaned at all times by worker bees that are part of her retinue. Drones are also very perishable. They die fairly quickly. If you put them in a cage by themselves, they will probably succumb to not just to loneliness, but to hunger and thirst and everything else fairly quickly. So workers also workers can stay and live for quite a long time on their own, but ultimately they will also die. It is the combination of all three of them that are dependent on each other. As I mentioned earlier, the most remarkable thing that has evolved in honeybees is their ability to communicate inside of that hive and tell each other where the food sources are, so they can gather this food from a great distance. As I mentioned earlier, the colony placement per acre is dependent on the crop, 2 to 3 for blueberries. In raspberries, well, raspberries are members of the Rosaceae, the rose family, and as a result, it attracts all kinds of pollinating insects, not just honeybees. So the placement rate out there is a bit lower. Cranberries requires a lot because, what I mentioned earlier, no nectar and only pollen is being offered to the bees. And apple is another good example. You don't need that many of them, but in grape, zero, because grape is self-fertile and it doesn't need bees to pollinate. Okay. So inside of a pollination unit, we have basically what we tell beekeepers and farmers, the 8-for-1 formula. And that means that you have 8 frames of bees covered with bees, or 8 frames covered with bees on both sides. 4 of those frames need to have bee brood in all stages of development, and you have to have 1 vigorous queen. So this is largely directed to farmers, but this illustrates how important and how it is connected with the agricultural industry. Okay. We have also in a pollination contract some key components that are needed, and I know that most of you will not be involved with this until much later for those that are ambitious in becoming larger beekeepers. I recommend first try slowly with your beekeeping activities, having a few colonies on the side, and start to learn how to appreciate the bees, how to basically to commune with them, how to get a feeling for what bees actually do and why they do things. It is also an activity that can be very addictive, honeybee or beekeeping, except, you know, for some people they may discover that they are sensitive to the bee stings. And while you don't have to get stung all the time, beekeeping does mean that you will get stung regularly. Well, there are some people that have hypersensitivity to bee stings, and as a result they may not be able to keep bees for very long. So don't over-invest in equipment and in materials and think now you're going to be into the bee business, while at the same time you may turn out to be hypersensitive to bee stings. The other thing is also all of us get older by the day, and in many cases beekeepers don't realize when they start out that at times, not all the time, but at times it is pretty physical work. These boxes can be quite heavy. And so sometimes beekeepers start to realize from, you know, I don't really care for carrying these boxes around too much. So their enthusiasm may wane. Again, start slow, learn how to keep bees successfully, and then expand at a later time. Again, I was talking earlier about other pollinators, and this is a good example where a nest of maybe 100 individuals in blueberries are around and only 50% may be foraging, while in honeybee colonies you have a much larger group of foraging at any one time. So, and then we have here the beautiful osmia bee, and again I will talk, or the blue orchard mason bee, and I will show you this booklet and pass this on to you at a later time to see for those that are interested in. There is also an awful lot of talk nowadays about how to maintain and enhance the pollinator fauna. And what I mean by that is all pollinators that are part of the environment. It is really important to remember that healthy ecosystems are very dependent on a rich diversity of pollinators. And what we have seen in modern agriculture or in many landscapes is a trend not only in a decline in pollinators, that is to say a reduction in the abundance of pollinators, but also a reduction in the quality of pollinators. In other words, a decline in the species diversity. So while in the past an ecosystem could have harbored 10 different species of pollinators, many habitats may have lost a few of them, and there may now only be 1 or 2 species of bees. It is this trend, this decline, or this trend towards the loss of diversity that is the biggest concern. Because with the decline in pollinator diversity, you will have ecosystems that are less resilient, that will become more sensitive to unseen developments, be it drought or flooding or heat waves or whatever they are. you have less of an ability for that ecosystem to recover. And that is why it is so important that we have become, as beekeepers, we should not just be keeping bees, but we should also be botanists or horticulturists and promote not to always get rid of everything that has no dollar value, but we should permit more undisturbed habitat to exist. As what we have seen in Europe, or particularly in England and in some other parts where there has been a strong promotion towards the development or the protection of riparian zones, hedgerows, and planting a greater diversity of floral sources, bee forage sources along the perimeters of crops and places like this. And planting for bee forage and so on, you can have a look at this particular website that I also communicated to you by email yesterday. What it says out here also is that we have, I mentioned this earlier, I just used blueberries as an example. When blueberries are in bloom for the bees, it is a period of feasting and there is plenty of food around. And as soon as the flowering stops, then the entire area is void of pollinators, of food sources, and then you have often a dearth period. For honeybees, that is mostly not the problem, but when you have bumblebees that are in the environment or individual pollinators, this can often result in failure of reproduction later in the season. And therefore you have a steady decline in native pollinators. By planting food sources for bees along the perimeters of cultivated fields and supporting hedgerows and riparian zones, you will make sure that these native pollinators can sustain themselves throughout the beekeeping or throughout the summer season, rather than face these temporary dearth periods or periods in which they run the risk of starvation. That is why it is so important that we address environmental issues as much as we actually be busy with keeping bees. Anyway, I always finish a nice photograph with the end of my presentation, and this is of course a beautiful honeybee. I would also like to point out here, since you see this honeybee, you see here the scopa. Not the scopa. Some bees carry their pollen here underneath the belly, and they're stiff hairs, and they call that then the scopa. But here, the tibia out here, you have a beautiful classic example of where honeybees can carry their pollen here on this tibia, and these stiff hairs form a basket, and they can then fill it up with pollen grains that they then bring to the nest for feeding the young ones. Okay, so I am going to now put this away again and get back to the screen. It is right now 10:15. Quarter past. I would just like to take a 10-minute break, and we will then resume in about